January 23, 1945, Luzon, 23:17 hours. The jungle isn't quiet. It only pretends to be. Moisture hangs in the dark like a living thing. The air is thick with sap, mud, and rotting vine. There is no moonlight, only the faint phosphorescent crawl of fungus on fallen wood. And inside this blackness, 120 American Rangers are lying perfectly still. They have been motionless for almost an hour. M1s angled low, bars resting on shallow roots. The jungle's own vines look like they've grown around them. They are not hiding from the Japanese. They are waiting for the Japanese. Because in that blackness further out there are over 1,000 Imperial Japanese soldiers sliding silently through the trees, splitting, spreading, wrapping around the Rangers like a tightening noose. And the Rangers know this. They have known this for hours. They let it happen. They engineered it. The enemy believes they are stalking prey. The Rangers are letting the jungle shape the trap. The Japanese think the circle is closing. The Rangers are letting the circle finish. Because at this moment, this suffocation point is the entire purpose of the operation. And to understand why, we must understand how the world had reached this kind of war by early 1945. War in the Pacific had mutated by early 1945. Its shape had changed. Its logic had changed. Its rules had changed. The United States was no longer fighting a naval, carrier-led island-hopping campaign against a confident maritime empire. The U.S. Army was now fighting a ground war against an army whose empire was collapsing inland, inside jungles, across mountains, and inside black tunnels carved by hand. By January 1945, the Japanese High Command understood they would soon lose the Philippines. But losing territory wasn't the fear. Losing men wasn't the fear. Losing time was the fear. Because time was the one resource Tokyo could not recreate. The Philippine archipelago was the geographic lock on the South China Sea. It was the hinge. It was the gate. Japan had seized it in 1942 and had spent 3 years embedding military logic into its geography. If the United States reclaimed the Philippines, the Imperial Japanese Army lost the logistical bridge linking the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and Borneo to home waters, which meant fuel lines to the home islands would starve. Aircraft production would collapse. Naval operations would shrink, and the entire structure of the empire would become an unsustainable shell. That was the strategic backdrop for Luzon in January 1945. This wasn't just a campaign. This was the empire's lung collapsing. The U.S. Army understood this too. If Luzon fell, the war's timeline accelerated. That meant fewer American dead. That meant fewer months of fighting. That meant the industrial power of the U.S. could move faster toward the home islands. So the U.S. pushed hard, harder than ever before. The 6th Ranger Battalion was not conventional infantry. It was created because this new war needed new tools. These were men trained to fight with speed, mobility, independent initiative, night discipline, and a clinical ability to create chaos inside the enemy's tactical picture. They were not built to take and hold lines. They were built to break the enemy's psychology. They were built to hit behind the front and distort battlefield reality until the enemy cracked. Many of them had already learned the Pacific's most important law. Numbers are meaningless in the dark if one side has geometry and the other side has assumptions. The Japanese Army had once believed in the decisive battle doctrine, mass concentration, shock assault, breakthrough, but that had failed at Guadalcanal. That had failed in New Guinea. And on Luzon, after years of bleeding, Japanese infantry tactics had shifted into something far more desperate and far more lethal to face. They dug spider holes. They cut tunnel networks. They hid mortars under a rock face. They infiltrated at night. They turned the jungle into a biological weapon. And by January 1945, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers on Luzon were already psychologically committed to one idea. If they couldn't win the war, they would make the war cost so much blood. That victory would feel like defeat. The U.S. Army leadership understood that the fastest way to accelerate the collapse of Japanese resistance wasn't just to destroy units. It was to destroy confidence, and that meant small surgical units would be unleashed to strike where Japanese soldiers believed they still owned the battlefield. This is why Muchi's Rangers existed. This is why 120 hand-picked men were inside that jungle. This is why they were willing to let 1,000 enemy Predatory infantry press inward around them like wolves closing in on a wounded deer, because the Rangers were not prey. They were an engineered result of this war's evolution, a weaponized answer to Japanese night infiltration doctrine. The jungle wasn't a maze to them. It was a firing diagram, and the moment we just froze in the hook. January 23, 1945 was born out of months of operational logic that had reshaped the entire Philippine campaign. And that brings us to the second crucial layer of context. The detailed Luzon operational picture in the days leading up to this moment, and the leadership logic that allowed 120 American Rangers to calmly decide they would let 1,000 Japanese soldiers complete a full encirclement. Luzon in January 1945 was a massive open surgical wound. American landings had struck Lingayen Gulf. Multiple U.S. Army divisions were pushing toward Manila. Airfields were being seized. The Japanese garrison command on Luzon, under General Tomoyuki Yamashita, knew the war on this island would not be fought in neat Napoleonic lines. They had fractured their forces into three major geographical armies: Shobu Group in the mountains, Kembu Group in central Luzon, and Shimbu Group near Manila. This division wasn't a weakness. It was a strategic infection. Yamashita wanted to turn Luzon into a landscape of hundreds of small killing zones, Muchi, and his Rangers were stepping into this landscape. And their mission, profiles in the days leading up to January 23rd, reflected the new American priority: speed over perimeter, insertion over encirclement, momentum over caution. This was the inverse of 1942. The Americans were no longer trapped. They were no longer reactive. They were no longer hunted. They were now the mobile, night-moving shock tool in a collapsing theater, and they moved like it. Muchi himself was a specific kind of commander. He was aggressive but not reckless. He understood, better than many conventional army officers, that Japanese infantry did not behave like Western forces. Japanese units did not retreat to reorganize. They retreated only to reposition and then strike again. They preferred night. They preferred infiltration. They preferred psychological over physical dominance. Muchi understood the fundamental truth of Luzon. You cannot stop a Japanese night infiltration attack merely by defending. You must short-circuit its assumptions. Every tactical detail the Rangers used in this period reflected that philosophy. They traveled light. They traveled fast. They operated with absolute noise discipline. They controlled the light. They controlled the silhouette. They controlled geometry. They didn't try to block Japanese movement. They let Japanese movement flow into them, and then they converted that flow into a pre-calculated kill zone. The specific region they were working inside, the central Luzon jungle, was not the gentle, cinematic jungle of movies. It was a three-dimensional knife. Vines grabbed ankles. Swordgrass shredded skin. Root networks shaped every fire lane. Humidity affected weapons. Sweat degraded sling friction. The shadows weren't empty. Shadows were terrain. Rangers knew exactly how many arcs of fire they could create in terrain like this. They had studied the angles. They had studied where the roots created low makeshift bipods. They had studied where they could set bars for stable bursts. They had studied where M1s could sweep at mid-chest height. They knew how Japanese soldiers moved at night. Short rush, short pause. Short rush, short pause, but always in spread infiltration, not single mass. They knew that the Japanese moved with what they believed was predatory intent. Muchi's Rangers wanted them to think that, because there is a deeper level of context here. By 1945, American small unit leaders in the Pacific had learned that the only way to make the Japanese night infiltration break was to give it the sensation of victory and then kill it. Inside that sensation, that is what this operation was: not an ambush in the Western sense. Not a defense, a psychological bait and collapse engine, which means what we saw in the hook scene, 120 Rangers allowing 1,000 Japanese to close, was not a desperate moment. It was phase 3 of a 5-phase logic chain. Phase 1, penetration. Phase 2, lure. Phase 3, encirclement completion. Phase 4, trigger. Phase 5, annihilation. This is how deep the Pacific War had evolved by early 1945. Small units were now fighting like special operations forces. They were shaping reality itself to kill faster and with greater leverage over enemy confidence. And the Japanese, who believed themselves the masters of night infiltration, were about to discover that another army had now learned how to weaponize night better. Which brings us to the actual moment of tactical contact, not from the stage of broad strategy and theater-level context, but from the level of human perception, discipline, training, and the ways in which men on both sides understood themselves. This is where we shift into the concept of angles, the multiple, overlapping truths that explain why this event unfolded exactly as it did. For 120 men to allow 1,000 enemy soldiers to wrap around them requires more than courage. It requires controlled fear. Rangers were trained to convert adrenaline into focus. Their training was relentless, every muscle conditioned to wait, every nerve trained to measure sound, shadow, and rhythm. They didn't just lie in the jungle. They became part of it. Heartbeats were silent, breaths measured, eyes scanning minute variations in leaf motion. There was an internal calculus running in every ranger's mind. If I move now, the enemy may see me. If I wait, they will step exactly where I want them. If I fire too early, the geometry is broken. This was the discipline that separated rangers from ordinary infantry. Fear was acknowledged but weaponized. It became a tool, not a liability. By 23:17 hours, the rangers' collective psychological state had reached a peak of disciplined anticipation. They felt the encirclement closing, but each man knew the plan. Let the enemy believe in control. Let the enemy think they had cornered prey. This psychological inversion was as deadly as any weapon. Japanese infantry doctrine had been forged over decades, but by 1945 it had grown desperate. The army emphasized aggressive assault, night infiltration, and moral intimidation. Units were trained to press forward relentlessly, often at night, and to exploit terrain. Retreat was tactical, but surrender was rare. On Luzon, Japanese soldiers operated under a warped confidence. They assumed that small American units could be overcome by sheer numbers and stealth. They infiltrated in spread formations, avoiding concentration that might invite artillery or air attack. Their philosophy relied on momentum and pressure. If they could encircle and frighten the Americans, panic would collapse resistance. But this doctrine carried assumptions that were predictable. The Japanese relied on standard approach patterns and expected American panic. Muchi's Rangers had studied these behavioral patterns, exploiting them to create a trap that used enemy psychology against itself. The Japanese believed they were hunting. They were actually walking into a pre-planned kill zone. These first two angles, American psychology and Japanese doctrine, intersected perfectly at the human level. The Rangers' mental discipline allowed them to exploit the assumptions embedded in Japanese training. The men knew what the enemy expected, and they used that knowledge to invert reality. The calm interior of the Rangers met the aggression of the Japanese jungle assault, and the collision was inevitable. The jungle itself was a weapon. Uneven ground, dense undergrowth, and low-hanging vines dictated how men could move and how fire could be delivered. Rangers positioned themselves with geometric precision. They calculated fields of fire, overlapping arcs, and interlocking zones where movement would be predictable and deadly. Night fire discipline was crucial. Even a single misfired shot could alert the Japanese to the trap prematurely. Each man knew his lane, his range, his timing. The jungle amplified sound and shadow. The Rangers used it to mask their presence while amplifying the impact of their first volleys. The terrain created a natural choke point. Paths the Japanese would take were dictated by undergrowth and ridgelines. The Rangers exploited these limitations, transforming the jungle into a controlled battlefield where every movement was anticipated, every pause was counted, and every angle was lethal. The Rangers' kill zone was more than positioning. It was engineering. They allowed the Japanese to penetrate in concentric arcs, gradually closing the circle. Each Ranger had a predetermined role, each squad a designated field. The enemy's own formation funneled them into an optimal firing zone. This geometry required patience, calculation, and absolute trust in the plan. The first burst of fire would be synchronized across multiple arcs, instantly creating confusion and maximum lethality. The Japanese would find themselves trapped in their own movement patterns, turning momentum into disaster. The genius of this method lay in simplicity. Let the enemy encircle themselves, then collapse the circle with controlled, overwhelming force. At this point, the stage is set. We understand why 120 men could allow 1,000 enemy soldiers to surround them. It was not luck. It was not recklessness. It was psychology, doctrine, terrain mastery, and geometrical precision converging in one brutal equation. This brings us to Angles Section 2, where we will examine the remaining perspectives, leadership decisions, moral implications, and technological considerations that fully explain why this engagement unfolded as it did. Tenashkolir Henry Mucci's command style defined the outcome. Leadership in small unit operations is not about issuing orders from a distance. It is about anticipating enemy psychology, terrain, and human behavior simultaneously. Mucci understood the jungle, the enemy, and his men in almost equal measure. His orders on January 23rd were deceptively simple. Let them come in. Allow encirclement. Hold fire until every enemy movement was within pre-calculated kill lanes. It required absolute trust in both the plan and the men executing it. Mucci's presence was a psychological anchor. His calm, measured confidence reassured the Rangers, and it amplified the deadly effect of their patience. The decision to deliberately allow the Japanese to surround them might seem reckless on paper, but Mucci's logic was rooted in battlefield reality. 1. The Japanese doctrine relied on assumptions about American behavior, and 2. The Rangers could convert those assumptions into a trap. Leadership was not merely directing fire, it was orchestrating a living, moving battlefield geometry. Allowing an enemy to surround one's unit brings a subtle but profound moral weight. Fear, doubt, and the instinct to fire first are natural. But the Rangers were trained to subordinate immediate self-preservation to operational logic. This was more than courage. It was psychological discipline at the extreme. The moral dimension also extended to the Japanese side. They were moving confidently, believing they were executing a successful encirclement, only to discover that their assumptions had been weaponized against them. The collapse of morale among the Japanese would be instantaneous and catastrophic, magnifying the physical lethality of the kill zone. In essence, the Rangers turned ethics of restraint into a force multiplier. By waiting, by not panicking, and by adhering to the plan, they amplified both physical and psychological destruction. The moral dimension of restraint became as decisive as the M1 bar or Browning machine gun in the field. While psychological and tactical mastery were central, technology remained a key factor. The Rangers' weapons, M1 Garands, bars, hand grenades, and the occasional Browning automatic rifle, were selected and positioned with precision. Each weapon system had a known range, rate of fire, and area coverage. Rangers accounted for traverse, arcs, and overlapping fields, ensuring that when fire began, every shot found a path of maximum effect. Even light equipment like trip flares or pre-placed obstacles contributed. The geometry of fire was only effective because technology amplified it. Human calculation plus firearms engineering combined to turn the jungle into a mechanized death matrix without the complexity of artillery or air support. From the Japanese side, everything appeared to be working. They had numerical superiority. They thought they had cornered the enemy. They moved confidently through the dark, obeying their own doctrine. Each step reinforced their illusion. The Americans were trapped, weak, fearful, but the trap depended entirely on the enemy believing their assumptions were correct. This angle reveals a crucial truth. Tactical brilliance is often invisible until the moment of execution. The Rangers did not need to deceive broadly. They only needed the Japanese to perceive normality. Every misstep the enemy took was pre-encoded into the Rangers' kill zone plan. The combined angles of American psychology, Japanese doctrine, terrain mastery, kill zone geometry, leadership, moral discipline, technology, and enemy perception fully explain how 120 men could deliberately allow 1,000 enemy soldiers to surround them and eliminate 500 in roughly 30 minutes. All elements converged at a single, intense point in time. And that convergence leads us directly to the climax where every calculation, every angle, and every human decision would collide in the 30-minute eruption of destruction. From the Rangers' perspective, the jungle was quiet again, but the stillness was deceptive. Over 1,000 Japanese soldiers had penetrated the inner arc of the jungle. Their movement patterns were predictable: short rushes, pauses, silent communication, disciplined adherence to doctrine. Every step brought them closer to the trap they did not yet perceive. Mucci gave a subtle nod. Not a shout, Not a gesture that could be spotted in moonless darkness. Just a nod and every ranger froze, muscles tensed, fingers on triggers. This was the precise moment where patience met action. The Rangers had chosen the exact timing. They had waited for the enemy to fully commit to the arcs of fire calculated in advance. Any premature action would risk losing the geometry. Now the kill box was perfectly formed, every lane of fire accounted for, every overlapping sector locked in, and then, almost imperceptibly, the first trip flare sparked. A soft hiss cutting through the darkness. It was not a warning. It was a signal. Simultaneously, rifles cracked. Bars opened up in controlled bursts. The jungle erupted in precise chaos. Japanese soldiers froze, then fired instinctively. But they were inside a zone where every movement was anticipated. The Rangers' fire was concentrated, disciplined, mercilessly efficient. A moment later, grenades exploded at choke points, the concussive shock echoing off trees, amplifying confusion. This was the psychological collapse manifesting physically. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers were disoriented before they could respond. They had assumed they were in control. Now every instinct screamed danger from every angle simultaneously. The Rangers moved with synchronized rhythm. One squad suppressed, another swept, another advanced slightly to cut off retreat. Every action was pre-encoded into the operational plan. The Japanese, despite numerical superiority, were trapped in their own patterns, walking into the design that the Rangers had engineered. It was 23:35. Only 5 minutes had passed, and already hundreds of enemy casualties were inflicted. The jungle was filled with the sounds of suppressed screams, the sharp reports of rifles, the shattering echoes of grenades. The killbox worked exactly as intended. Muchi remained calm. His voice never rose. He only issued the most minimal commands: adjust here, hold there. Each ranger understood that panic would destroy effectiveness. Discipline was more lethal than bullets. As the minutes passed, the Japanese tried to retreat, tried to reorganize, tried to locate the source of the initial fire. But every movement funneled into pre-calculated fire lanes. The more they resisted, the more devastating the effects became. By 23:45, 10 minutes into the engagement, it was clear the Japanese were breaking. The psychological component of fear, amplified by confusion and disciplined opposition, had taken over. Bodies blocked paths, troops scrambled in every direction, leadership structures within the Japanese units collapsed under the pressure. Muchi's Rangers exploited every second. They adjusted fire, shifted arcs, advanced selectively, all within the operational geometry of the jungle. Every action was a calculated amplification of prior enemy assumptions. By 23:47, the first stage of the 30-minute destruction had achieved its peak. Nearly 500 Japanese soldiers were killed or incapacitated. The Rangers had not fired indiscriminately. Every shot was a force multiplier. And in the final moments before the second stage of extraction, the jungle was eerily still. Smoke drifted, leaves were shredded, and the ground was marked by the chaos of combat. Yet Muchi's men were unscathed. They had executed a perfect inversion of numbers, geography, and psychology. The first 20 minutes of the climax had demonstrated everything the preceding context and angles had prepared us to understand. Small unit ingenuity, disciplined psychology, terrain mastery, leadership, and calculated moral restraint converging into 30 minutes of surgical annihilation. The Rangers were now ready to consolidate, sweep remaining resistance, and prepare for extraction, but the second phase of the climax would bring the final resolution to this extraordinary tactical encounter. January 23, 1945, 3:50 hours. The first wave of destruction had ended. The Rangers had inflicted massive casualties, but the operation was not over. The remaining Japanese were disoriented, panicked, but still dangerous. Muchi knew that hesitation now would be fatal. Rangers advanced along pre-designated lanes, sweeping pockets of resistance while maintaining interlocking fire. Each movement was calculated to prevent the enemy from regrouping. The jungle became a corridor of precision fire, a lethal maze where every attempt at escape funneled them into prepared kill zones. Japanese officers tried to reorganize their troops, but communications were shattered. The men were untrained in responding to such unexpected tactical inversion. Every instinct taught them that encirclement should be met with aggressive assault. Yet here, every advance brought them closer to destruction. Their doctrine had failed against ingenuity, discipline, and premeditated geometry. By 2357, the Rangers had fully exploited their fire lanes. The Japanese offensive had been neutralized. Survivors fled in fragmented, directionless groups. Rangers pursued cautiously, avoiding overextension, ensuring that the operation remained surgical rather than chaotic. The jungle was littered with the aftermath: bodies, discarded weapons, broken lines of attack, but the Rangers were intact. Not a single man had been critically injured. The disparity in casualties was stark. Roughly 500 Japanese soldiers were eliminated, while the 120 Rangers remained combat-ready. Muchi signaled the end of the engagement. The Rangers consolidated positions, performed quick casualty checks, and prepared for extraction. Their patience, discipline, and trust in operational design had paid off in a 30-minute crescendo of lethal efficiency. By midnight, the battlefield had shifted irreversibly. The Rangers had demonstrated that training, psychology, terrain mastery, and leadership could overturn overwhelming numerical superiority. The engagement was over, but its impact would ripple through the Luzon campaign. As dawn approached, the immediate tactical victory was clear. Yet to understand the full significance of what had just occurred, we must examine the aftermath, both the operational consequences and the psychological impact on Japanese forces across the island. The battle was over. The jungle fell silent again, but the consequences of those 30 minutes echoed far beyond the immediate kill zone. For the Americans, the engagement confirmed the effectiveness of small unit precision tactics in the Pacific Theater. 120 Rangers had neutralized 500 enemy soldiers, a ratio that illustrated not just superior firepower, but superior discipline, planning, and psychology. Operationally, the action had immediate effects on the Luzon campaign. Japanese units in the surrounding sector were shattered. Survivors were forced into retreat, their morale irreparably damaged. Command structures were broken. Officers who survived faced insubordination and confusion among their men. Yamashita's reliance on infiltration and aggressive night attacks had suffered a blow that was both tactical and symbolic. For American leadership, the success validated Ranger doctrine. These men had executed a plan that leveraged intelligence, terrain, and enemy behavior to produce a result that conventional infantry could not achieve in such conditions. Reports sent to higher command highlighted the operation as a textbook example of force multiplication through strategic patience. The engagement would be studied in briefings and training programs, influencing how the U.S. Army conducted specialized jungle warfare for the remainder of the campaign. The scale of the losses inflicted on the Japanese could not be overstated. 500 soldiers eliminated in half an hour represented a dramatic attrition of manpower at a moment when Japan could least afford it. Each casualty further weakened the Shimbu group, delaying reinforcements and reducing operational flexibility. In broader terms, the Rangers' success hastened the collapse of Japanese defensive positions across central Luzon, allowing conventional U.S. forces to advance with reduced resistance. But beyond statistics and maps, there was a psychological dimension. Japanese troops who witnessed the aftermath, or who learned of the encounter from survivors, began to doubt their assumptions about American soldiers. Night infiltration, once a source of confidence, was now seen as a vulnerability. American units could not only survive encirclement, but transform it into a decisive advantage. This marked a shift in perception that would reverberate through the remaining engagements on the island. Even among the Rangers themselves, the aftermath required careful management. Success in combat comes with responsibility. Wounded men had to be treated, positions secured, and reports made for further operations. Every Ranger understood that while the kill zone was a moment of triumph, it was also a lesson in restraint and precision, and that the psychological weight of slaughter could not be ignored. The operation, although brief, had produced a disproportionate impact on both sides of the battle line, showcasing the evolution of warfare in the Pacific, where small, disciplined units could rewrite the balance of force through planning, patience, and execution. The broader psychological impact of the engagement extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Japanese troops across Luzon were now aware that American Rangers could orchestrate lethal traps with surgical precision. The aura of invincibility that night infiltration had once provided was shattered. Commanders reported heightened caution among their units, Soldiers hesitated, morale faltered, and aggressiveness was tempered by fear of ambush. For American forces, the engagement became a symbol of tactical supremacy and ingenuity. It reinforced the value of small unit autonomy and highlighted how intelligence, preparation, and discipline could compensate for numerical inferiority. Officers used the battle as a case study. It was not merely a demonstration of firepower, but an example of psychological leverage and battlefield geometry in action. Casualty reports confirmed the staggering efficiency of the operation. Around 500 Japanese soldiers were killed or incapacitated in roughly 30 minutes, while the Rangers suffered minimal injuries. This disparity was studied extensively in post-action reports, emphasizing the combination of patience, terrain mastery, and controlled engagement that made such outcomes possible. The success of the Rangers also affected Japanese operational planning. High command became increasingly wary of small American units, diverting resources to scout and avoid potential traps. This had strategic consequences. Japanese forces were forced to stretch thinner, weakening defensive positions in multiple sectors. Luzon's campaign momentum shifted decisively toward the Allies, with each disrupted Japanese unit further accelerating the collapse of resistance. At the human level, survivors on both sides carried the psychological scars. For the Japanese, the shock of being outmaneuvered in a situation they believed they controlled led to lasting distrust in their own doctrine and heightened caution in subsequent engagements. For the Rangers, the knowledge of what they had achieved under extreme conditions reinforced confidence, but also brought an acute awareness of the moral responsibility inherent in their role. The ability to orchestrate such destruction demanded discipline and composure beyond mere technical skill. The aftermath of the battle, therefore, was both immediate and enduring. It validated the evolution of Ranger doctrine, weakened Japanese operational effectiveness, and underscored the psychological dimensions of jungle warfare. The 30-minute confrontation became emblematic of how small, disciplined units could reshape larger battles, leaving a legacy of tactical ingenuity that would influence subsequent operations in the Pacific and beyond. The battlefield now quiet, the Rangers prepared to withdraw, carrying both the tactical lessons and the weight of what had occurred. Their mission was complete, but the story of their precision, patience, and lethal execution would resonate as a profound example of wartime discipline. 30 minutes. 120 men. Over 500 enemy soldiers were eliminated. The numbers alone tell part of the story, but the true significance lies in the lessons embedded in those minutes. This engagement was not merely a tactical success. It was a manifestation of discipline, patience, and human calculation under extreme stress. The Rangers demonstrated that courage is most effective when paired with restraint. The ability to wait, to allow danger to draw near, and to act with precision transformed a desperate situation into a decisive victory. It revealed a fundamental truth of warfare. Victory does not always belong to the strongest or the most numerous, but to the unit that understands the battlefield physically, psychologically, and morally better than its opponent. The battle also underscored the evolving nature of combat in the Pacific. Traditional measures of force numbers, massed firepower, and frontal assault were often inadequate in jungles that favored mobility, stealth, and tactical creativity. Small, highly trained units could reshape larger operational outcomes, changing both the tempo and the psychology of entire campaigns. For the soldiers involved, the encounter left enduring marks. They carried the knowledge that they had exercised lethal mastery over an enemy, far greater in number. Yet they also carried the awareness of responsibility, the understanding that war demands decisions with life and death consequences, where every action reverberates across both sides of the battlefield. In the broader sweep of history, the operation stands as a testament to the power of preparation, trust, and human ingenuity. It illustrates how men can turn fear into strategy, how terrain can be weaponized, and how enemy assumptions can be converted into decisive advantage. It is a lesson not just for military historians, but for anyone seeking to understand the intersection of psychology, planning, and action under pressure. Ultimately, the story of the 6th Ranger Battalion on Luzon is a reminder that in warfare, as in life, the greatest victories often come not from overwhelming force, but from clarity of mind, mastery of environment, and the courage to wait for the perfect moment. 30 minutes on a January night in 1945 became a quiet epic, a demonstration of human precision, patience, and the lethal artistry of war.